So this is how your board is going to look before your first two-player game of Sovereign Chess. A few things I want to point out before we start talking about the game. One is you're not going to use all of the pieces that are given to you in setting up the board. Mostly you're going to have extra kings of different colors except for white and black left over. You're going to have light and dark gray pawns, which are not used in the two-player game, but rather in the four-player game. And you're going to have an extra black and white queen that we're not going to use now, but may come into play later in your game. The setup for the board, of course, is in a diagram in the rules that are given to you in the game, but also there are these notations on the side of the board, these letters and numbers used for references if you want to keep track of your game. And you might notice that each of these letters and numbers are a different color and have a slightly shaded shape behind them. So the 6 with a little faded knight behind it that's in blue says that the blue knight goes on this square. Once you have all of the major pieces around the edge of the board, you put pawns in of matching colors next to them, with the exception of the gray armies, which have knights here on the corners of their little armies right there. Now I want to show you just very quickly how some of the basic movements of the game work. If you know how to play traditional chess, then learning that the movements and the rules of Sovereign Chess shouldn't take too much extra work. Most of the pieces move like in traditional chess. So the king moves one square in any direction and captures that way as well. The knights move in that funny L shape where they go 2 squares in one direction and 1 square in another direction. Knights, of course, can jump over other pieces and capture whatever they land on. And then the queens, the bishops, and the rooks, which all move like traditional chess, have just one small variation, and that is their length. They can only go up to 8 squares because that is the size of a regular chessboard. So this queen can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares, but can go no further on a single move. All of the pieces in Sovereign Chess can go across the board in 2 moves, but not necessarily in 1. One other rule difference here in Sovereign Chess, you'll notice the colored squares, which we're going to talk about in another video, but a piece can never actually land on a square of its own color. There are some gameplay reasons for that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, and that's actually very important as far as the strategy goes as well. Now, the most important feature of Sovereign Chess is how pawns move in the game. Like traditional chess, most pawns can move 1 or 2 squares forward on their first turn, and usually they would go 1 square forward on subsequent turns. In Sovereign Chess, because there are pawns all around the board, the pawns are all going to go to the middle of the board, which means that this black pawn right here that I've advanced quite a ways can go 1 square forward or also 1 square sideways toward these kinds of brown lines that are on the board. These brown lines, which are kind of on the creases of where the board folds, points the pawns toward the center of the board. If later I were to move one of these orange pawns, we'll talk about control of that in a while, then I could move this orange pawn 1 or 2 squares out, and I could move it on the next turn either 1 square forward or 1 square toward that brown line. You'll also notice that, for example, this other black pawn right here, it can actually move 1 square toward this brown line, which is going toward the center of the board. And on a later turn, because it's still on this second, what I call the second ring of the board, it can still move 1 or 2 squares forward on a future turn. One important thing to notice about Sovereign Chess is that in the middle of the board, there is a dark black outline around the middle 4x4 square of the board. When a pawn advances inside that 4x4 square, then the pawn promotes. In most cases, you would promote it to a major piece, like a bishop or a knight or a rook. In most cases, we would usually promote it to a queen. So I'm going to pull a queen out here and use that. In Sovereign Chess, you can also promote your pawn to a king, but I'll talk about that in a future video. If we were to advance a colored pawn inside that 4x4 square, then you would promote it to a higher piece of that same color. The last feature about pawns that sometimes is a little unusual for people is how pawns capture. Pawns capture as long as they go toward the middle of the board, specifically if they go towards one of these brown lines. And of course, pawns can only capture diagonally and only if there's an opposing piece that it can take. So this pawn right here, if there were other pieces around it, this pawn could of course capture in this direction. It could capture in this direction because it's going toward this brown line. And it can also capture in this direction because it's going toward this brown line here along the center of the board as well. The only direction the pawn cannot go is capturing in this direction because it's going away from both of the brown lines. If a pawn is, let's say, up against a brown line, it can only move forward. It can't move across the brown line because that's kind of considered equidistant from the center. But the pawn can still capture in two directions. It can capture in this direction because it's going toward these brown lines. It can also capture in this direction because it's going toward these brown lines as well. And then from there can either capture or move into the center of the board where it would promote. Once you get the basic ideas of movement of pieces in sovereign chess, then we get to some of the more advanced rules about controlling colors and other special rules, but we'll talk about those in another video. Enjoy your first game of sovereign chess, and I'll be back with more rules in a few minutes.